All right, welcome to our second lesson for unit or section 2. So we are still talking about plant reproduction. In this lesson, we're specifically going to talk about pollination and then fertilization. So learning goal here is that you will be able to describe the steps of pollination and fertilization and then describe the different types of pollination that there are. So we're going to start with a couple key definitions. We may have mentioned some of these before, but I just want to make sure going into this we feel okay. Some of these will come from this class. Some of it should be prior knowledge from biology. So first is pollination, and pollination is the transfer of pollen from the male reproductive organ, which is the anther, to the female reproductive organ, which is the stigma. And then fertilization is the fusion of male and female gametes, sperm and egg, to form a zygote. This is true for animals, plants, all of that. Still fertilization, it's just this is going to be pollen, and then it's like an ovule in a plant. And then gametes are specialized reproductive cells. For plants, that's going to be pollen and ovules. All right, so we really briefly talked about reproductive organs in our last lesson. We're going to get a little bit more specific this time. So let's start with the male reproductive organ for plants, and that's going to be the stamen. So the entire reproductive organ is called the stamen, but it has two specific parts. The anther is where the pollen is produced. So that's this right here. And then the filament is what supports the anther. So if we look at this really close up picture here, this right here is going to be the anther, and then this that's holding it up is the filament. So all of these where we see all that pollen on it, all of those are the anthers. That's where the pollen's released. And then all of the kind of like stems holding those up, those are the filament. All right, moving on to the female reproductive organ. This is the pistil. So that is this whole part right here is known as the pistil. It also has specific parts. So up at the top, we have the stigma that catches the pollen. The style holds up the stigma and connects it to the ovary down here. Then the ovary is where the ovules are, and that's what turns into seeds when it's fertilized by the pollen. So if we look at this close-up guy here, the stigma right here is what catches the pollen. So this one's really special. It has like all these little hairs that we can see, so that these little pollen grains, if it was self-fertilizing, could land here. And then we have the style that connects it down, and we can't see it here, but down below is going to be the ovary. So each one of these is a stigma. And then each bit that's connecting it down to the ovary is going to be the style, and this entire thing is known as the pistil. All right, so for the act of actual pollination, pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma. There are two types of pollination. There's different ways plants are pollinated, but two different types of real pollination. One is self-pollination. This means that pollen from the same flower fertilizes the same flower. So like if we're looking at these flowers over here, here's the anthers with that pollen. So if this pollen makes it onto that stigma and into the flower and fertilizes it, that would be self-fertilization. Cross or self-pollination. Cross-pollination is going to be pollen from one flower fertilizes another flower from the same species. So if this bee takes this pollen and lands on another similar plant or the same species of plant that's another individual, that would be cross-pollination. Many plants can do both. Some plants are especially have special timing with when they will have their anthers out or their ovules out or whatever, so that it pushes cross-pollination. Some plants, their flowers only have female parts on one plant, and then a whole nother plant has the male part. So we have like female and male plants, and that would force cross-pollination. But both of those are the two types of pollination. All right, so for agents of pollination, so how pollination can actually happen, not just like from one plant to another. So pollination can happen through wind, through insects, and also through birds and bats. So this is what wind pollination can look like. This is why we get allergies when the trees are releasing all their pollen. So it really is just the pollen blows in the wind, and hopefully it catches on to another flower. This is actually a grass flower. This is what the flower of some grasses look like, and most grasses, if not all, are pollinated through wind pollination. This is insect pollination. Save the bees, the bumblebees. So all of this pollen is sticking to this bee, and it's going to go along to all of the different flowers and carry that pollen across. That would be insect pollination. It can also be done by butterflies and other insects. Then we have bird and bat pollination. So hummingbirds are a big one. They drink the nectar, and inevitably they're going to get some pollen on themselves that they then are transferring through, and then bats can do the same thing. So the actual process of pollination, there's three main steps. First is that pollen is produced in the anther. So anther right here produces pollen. Then the pollen is carried by a pollinator, like the bee, covered in pollen right here. And then 3, pollen is deposited on the stigma of another flower. And it's not like this bee walks over and is like, all right, here's our stigma right here. I'm just going to purposely put that pollen on there. It's not purposefully thinking about it. It is just happening because it's crawling all over that flower. Some of the pollen is going to end up on the stigma. So fertilization, again, the definition is it's the fusion of the male and female gametes to form a zygote. So in plants, that's going to be the pollen and the ovules. So we have a pollen tube. So we have the 3 steps that happened before. The anther released pollen grains. That pollen grain is going to land on the end of the stigma. And then the pollen grain itself actually forms a pollen tube that goes all the way down the style into the ovary and fertilizes an ovule. And there's a graphic on the next slide that shows it as well, but here's our pollen tube going all the way down. The sperm nuclei travels through the pollen tube, so the nucleus of that pollen grain goes down that tube until it fuses with an egg cell in the ovule. So that can also look like this. So here's our pollen grain. It lands on the stigma. It releases this tube down the style until it reaches an egg or an ovule, and it fertilizes that egg or ovule by sending its nucleus down that tube. All right, so why is fertilization significant? We need plants to fertilize themselves, and plants need to fertilize themselves to get seeds. That's, the goal of fertilization. But it's also important for genetic diversity, especially when there's cross-pollination. So cross-pollination leads to genetic diversity, which enhances adaptation and evolution. If every plant was always just cloning itself or self-fertilizing, we wouldn't have genetic diversity, and it would make our plants really susceptible to disease. If every plant had the same exact genes, then every time a disease came out that affected one, it would wipe out the entire population. So genetic diversity, cross-pollination is super, super important. All right, brief review of some of what we went over in this lesson. So pollination is the transfer of pollen from male to female reproductive organs. Fertilization is the fusion of male and female gametes. Agents of pollination could be wind, insects, birds, and bats. And then it's important, it's essential for plant reproduction and genetic diversity. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in the next one.